speech therapists aren't, at least I don't think that they're getting training in sensory integration.
No, they
unless
don't.
Unless they're taking this after they've graduated, unless they have a mentor, unless they go and get this additional training, but it's not something that's taught to them in school.
And it does bring up the question of what's within the scope of practice, which we as occupational therapy practitioners have to ask ourselves as well. From an OT standpoint, communication, like overall communication, is within our scope of practice. We've had people ask these things before of like, can I take your course even if I'm a speech therapist? Because I don't know if it's within my scope of practice. And I think that we can kind of play around with the wording and the verbiage and say, yes, it is going to be within your scope of practice, simply because movement will facilitate communication.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica. And this is All Things Sensory by Harkla.
We are both certified occupational therapy assistants, and together with Harkla, we are on a mission to empower parents, therapists, and educators to help raise confident and strong children of all abilities.
On this podcast, we chat about all things sensory, diving into special needs, occupational therapy, parenting, self-care, overall health and wellness, and so much more.
We are here to provide raw, honest, and fun strategies, ideas, and information for parents, therapists, and educators, as well as other professionals to implement into daily life.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, welcome back to All Things Sensory by Harkla. We're so happy to have you. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica.
And we are both occupational therapy assistants. We're also both certified primitive reflex clinical specialists. And today we are talking about speech language pathologists and sensory strategies. Should SLPs use sensory strategies during their speech sessions?
Ooh, that's a question.
And we actually had a lot of conversations about this topic without knowing that we were going to talk about this today before we started talking about it.
Did we?
We talked about Tripp and his speech therapist session.
That's right.
And we talked about your coworker.
Yes.
So I think we should talk about those.
Do you want to go first? We may as well just recreate the conversation.
Let's just recreate it. Okay. So I took Tripp to a speech therapist because he has a little bit of a lateral lisp right now. He's 4. And I just wasn't sure if this is kind of an age appropriate thing that he'll grow out of, or is this something that we should just intervene with right now? And my gut told me, as a therapist, when in doubt, rule it out. That's what I tell all of you. So I figured, why not listen to my own advice? I found a speech therapist who's really close to us. So great, let's get in. They didn't even do an evaluation. She just did like a quick little screener. And she was like, yeah, this is something that we could work on really quick and we could improve it. Great, great, great. So then Jessica was like,
wait, hold on. Sorry. This wasn't part of the conversation we're recreating, but it just popped in my head as a question. So did she say that the lateral lisp is not age appropriate?
She said it is somewhat age appropriate, but the fact that I mentioned that it was one of the speech sounds that hasn't improved, whereas like all of his other sounds have improved. This is the one that's lingered the longest.
Okay.
So that was kind of where that went.
Okay.
So we were talking about the clinic and what the space looked like. And I was like, it was this, one room. It was great. It was very simple, but it wasn't like a sterile environment. There was a couch, there was a table, there was like storage cabinets. And Jess was like, so there's no swings, there's no tunnels, there's no movement. And I was like, no. And so then we started talking about pros and cons to that, and how when we use movement I'm not a speech therapist, but from an OT standpoint, how we use movement, we generally get more speech sounds and we get more communication, especially from our kids with limited verbal communication. And it's just more fun. It's more fun with movement.
And then I started bragging on the speech therapist that I currently work with. Shout out to her, because and this is what I told Rachel, I don't know that I've ever seen her sit at a desk with a client and just work on speech sounds. She has one client, and if I'm wrong and you're listening, Amy, you can let me know. But one client that I know, they're working specifically on like articulation and speech sounds, and they are constantly in the treatment gym. Mm-hmm. She's always taking this specific client into the treatment gym, and they are doing movement with their speech session. And I just thought it was such a great example of, this is not a speech therapist who's sitting at a desk doing flashcards working on sounds, just, I would call it a boring session for a kid to have to sit there for 30 minutes, not moving, right? And she just does such a great job incorporating sensory movement strategies and asking the OTs in the clinic for ideas and collaborating. And so then I, told Rachel, I was like, well, I hope Tripp's speech therapist doesn't just sit him at the desk and work on his lisp, because that'll be real boring, especially for a 4-year-old.
And what brought that conversation up was I was doing some of the activities that she'd recommended us practice with him. And he was like, I don't want to do this. Like, he didn't want to do it with me, because we were looking in the mirror. It was like a quick thing. It wasn't like I was setting up this whole extravagant activity for him. It was like, okay, and it was hard for him to close his teeth and like get his tongue. And he was like, I don't want to do this. So I really wasn't knocking the speech therapist. I actually really like her. I thought that her approach was great.
And I don't know anything about her.
Jessica doesn't know her.
It's just my first thought.
Yes, exactly. And I was thinking like, great, it's not a distracting environment. There's no other kids there. It's just this one room. But then as we were talking, I was like, God, it would be great if he could sit on a therapy ball, or if there was a swing, or if he could crawl through the tunnel and do an activity and then go back and go forth. So really, it just kind of sparked this conversation of, should speech therapists incorporate sensory strategies? I wouldn't even necessarily say sensory strategies. I would just say movement.
Sure.
Which movement is a sensory activity, but if we're,
everything is a sensory activity. Let's be real.
Speech therapists aren't, at least I don't think that they're getting training in sensory integration.
No, they
unless
don't.
Unless they're taking this after they've graduated, unless they have a mentor, unless they go and get this additional training. But it's not something that's taught to them in school.
And it does bring up the question of what's within the scope of practice, which we as occupational therapy practitioners have to ask ourselves as well.
Oh, yeah.
From an OT standpoint, communication, like overall communication, is within our scope of practice.
Functional communication.
And that means anything, right? Communicating wants and
like
needs, social
articulation.
Correct. Communication from standpoint of social interaction, communicating wants and needs. So like when I'm working with a client with an AAC device and working on modeling and communicating with that's within my scope of practice, even though that's something that's generally used with an SLP, right? Now, our sensory strategies, movement, those types of things, is that within the scope of practice for a speech and language pathologist? And we've had people ask these things before of like, can I take your course even if I'm a speech therapist? Because I don't know if it's within my scope of practice. And I think that we can kind of play around with the wording and the verbiage and say, yes, it is going to be within your scope of practice, simply because movement will facilitate communication. When we move, we get a brain-body connection that activates different parts of our brain that will open up that communication, whether it's verbal or nonverbal.
Yeah, definitely. So, a couple of interesting conversations to kind of start this podcast episode. And I think that we can give our speech therapists who are listening to this episode, or even parents or OTs, just some strategies of how you can include some of these sensory strategies into your sessions without crossing that barrier of like, well, this isn't really in my scope of practice. We're not going to tell you, okay, grab a brush. We're going to do the deep pressure brushing protocol, or, here's the swing. We're going to make sure that we're doing it this and this and this and this. It's like, just keep it simple. Let's not get overwhelmed. Let's not, get our panties in a wad about who's doing this and what and stepping on toes. It's just, no, we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to include some movement activities. If you're working on flashcards and working on specific articulation sounds, like we said, crawl through a tunnel, pick a card, crawl back, practice that sound.
Sure. Simple.
That's really simple. Kids are getting movement. If you have a swing available and we always loved using Beanie Babies. Grab a Beanie Baby. What animal is it? Make the sound. What letter does it start with? That's the sound that it makes. Whatever it is that you're trying to address with your goals, you can do the same activities, but you can do them on a swing. You can do them on a therapy ball. You can do them on a play structure. You can have them go across the slide and, pick a card and go back up, or, whatever goals you can address. You can include a movement activity, and chances are you'll achieve your goals faster if you are including those strategies.
I think so. Anecdotally.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure
there is research out there. I
is.
found a research study out there specifically when I was talking about this on Instagram of kids with, I think, who were pre-verbal, had very limited verbal communication skills, and you put them on a swing and we got more verbal communication from them.
Well, we've talked about the connection between speech communication and vestibular processing. I think we have an episode on that.
I think so too.
If we do, if we're correct, we'll link it below in the show notes.
If we're correct. There's so many. We've lost track.
I think we are. But also, I think we need to think about sensory regulation, emotional regulation, sensory overload. If a child comes into a speech therapy session and they are having a bad day, they're dysregulated, maybe there was a field trip at school, and so they got a lot of sensory overload, and now they're in a state of fight or flight, and they're coming in for a speech session, and they need to be able to access those parts of the brain for communication and speech and articulation, whatever it is they're working on. They're not going to be able to do that if their body is not regulated, if their nervous system is dysregulated, they're in a state of fight or flight. So using sensory strategies and tools in that moment in order to get them to a place of regulation so they can work on what they need to work on with their speech therapist is very important.
Yeah. So one thing that we want to make that I was just thinking about too, as you were talking about that, was using a strategy like a weighted vest. I know that we work with a lot of clients who are wiggly and bouncy and have a hard time sitting still. Using a sensory strategy like a weighted vest in that situation is not going to be your go-to because you haven't met that child's threshold. So if you are a therapist and you're like, this kid won't sit still, they won't do their work, lean into that. Try to do more movement-based activities, more heavy work activities, pushing, pulling, crawling, running, jumping, and then bring them back to the table if that's something that you need to work on. Then try a weighted vest in conjunction with an occupational therapist as well and see if that helps. But we're not just going to throw random things like a weighted vest on a child during a session and see if that calms them down. Things like grabbing a vibrating ball and having them hold a vibrating ball, or having them play with Play-Doh while they're at the table. Those are some other strategies, or a fidget even that, here's my little ASMR. Using a fidget at the table or some manipulatives at the table to keep their hands busy and to keep their brain a little bit busy. I mean, that's not rocket science, but it's just something to try. Mm-hmm.
The other piece is our kids are meant to move,
what?
Right?
No.
Yes.
No. They have to sit down from 8 to 5.
I know, it's the worst. I don't even like to do that.
I can't do it.
We've been doing it all day.
I know. I'm losing it. I am about to burst my bubble.
Let's finish. Let's wrap it up. What was I saying?
Kids are meant to move.
Okay, kids are meant to move. Their bodies and their brains are designed to move and play and run and jump. Even if they're struggling with those types of activities, that's what they're designed to do. Even us as adults, we're designed to move. So if you can get your kid, your client on the floor, in a swing, on a crash pad, on the slide, whatever you have available, even if you don't have any equipment available, you can create a tunnel with your chairs and your desk for them to crawl under and lay under. And really just getting on the floor, moving, playing, you're going to see so much more engagement. Your clients will have more fun if you're getting them moving and playing in different ways. And I think really communication just blossoms when children are having fun.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
why we have to build that rapport with our clients and build that connection to make sure that we are playing. And also making sure that we are recommending these strategies for our families at home and our caregivers at home to continue to incorporate this. And when you get a home exercise program, we're not just going to sit at the table and practice these boring sounds. I mean, clearly that didn't work for me. So I have to start being more creative in how I practice this. And kids are always so much more resistive when it's their parents doing
so
stuff.
much.
So I got to really figure that out. But
I know.
Anyways, there's some stories for you.
Yeah, let's give some specific ideas. If you're a speech therapist listening to this, or if you are an OT and you work with a speech therapist, maybe you can send them this episode, or maybe you have really good rapport with them and you guys collaborate all the time. Here's some ideas. Use a variety of different objects and tools like sensory therapy balls, wiggle cushions, different types of seating. If you are having the client sit at a table, is going to be really helpful.
Yeah. And then also using movement, using rhythm, using a metronome, singing songs to learn different sounds or different patterns or rhymes. And even just like think about coordinating movements with learning materials. Like one thing that we'll do for spelling words is clap with the beat of the metronome, or bounce the ball with the beat of the metronome, or do jumping jacks with the beat of the metronome. So use that rhythm and that movement and that multi-sensory approach in order to help kind of solidify some of these skills.
Yeah, and then look into using more oral motor activities to really stimulate the different muscles of the oral structures, bubble mountain, blowing pom-poms, maybe chewing gum or using sour spray if you have the parents' permission for stuff like that. Those are always great tools as well.
Yep. And then for any speech therapists who are listening, make sure that you do connect with an occupational therapist or an occupational therapy assistant. Ask them your questions, brainstorm, work together. If you are able to co-treat in situations, then, by all means work together in that instance. But, social media is a great way to connect with other therapists too, and to find mentorship and to find some additional resources. So don't be afraid to ask for help. We don't know it all. And admitting that and recognizing that is a huge step to success in therapeutic practice.
And I will tell you, one of my favorite things is collaborating with the speech therapist that I work with right now. And actually, I've also collaborated with one of my clients' speech therapists who she works at a different clinic. But she and I have communicated via email about strategies from both directions of different things to try. So I love being able to do that. So definitely make sure you're doing that if you're working with a child and they have services from another professional. Make sure you're communicating with them.
Yep. If you haven't already left us a review, make sure you leave us a review. Make sure you leave a comment if you're on YouTube or if you're on Spotify. Leave a 5-star review. Let us know your thoughts. We appreciate your feedback. And then if you want to continue this conversation, send us a DM on Instagram at All Things Sensory Podcast. We'd love that.
We also love it when you take a screenshot of the episode you're listening to and share it in stories and tag us.
Yeah. And with that, we'll plan on seeing you next week for another podcast/video episode.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening to All Things Sensory by Harkla.
If you want more information on anything mentioned in the show, head over to harkla.co/podcast to get the show notes.
If you have any follow-up questions, the best place to ask those is in the comments on the show notes or message us on our Instagram account, which is at Harkla_family or at All Things Sensory Podcast. If you just search Harkla, you'll find us there.
Like we mentioned before, our podcast listeners get 10% off their first order at Harkla. Whether it's for one of our digital courses or one of our sensory swings, the discount code SENSORY will get you 10% off. That's SENSORY.
Head to harkla.co/sensory to use that discount code right now.
We are so excited to work together to help create confident kids all over the world. While we make every effort to share correct information, we're still learning.
We will double check all of our facts, but realize that medicine is a constantly changing science and art.
One doctor or therapist may have a different way of doing things from another.
We are simply presenting our views and opinions on how to address common sensory challenges, health-related difficulties, and what we have found to be beneficial that will be as evidence-based as possible.
By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or your child.
Consult your child's pediatrician or therapist for any medical issues that he or she may be having.
This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast.
Thanks so much for listening.